The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty settlement of Copper Ridge as Jake Morrison guided his weathered horse through the main street. The town seemed unusually quiet for midday, with most folks taking shelter from the brutal heat. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors of work at the copper mines, but what he found instead would change his life forever. As he approached the town square, a crowd had gathered around a hastily constructed gallows. The wooden structure stood ominously against the backdrop of red desert cliffs, casting long shadows across the dirt. Jake's stomach tightened as he noticed 2 young Apache women standing on the platform, their hands bound behind their backs, nooses already placed around their necks. The crowd below buzzed with angry voices and hostile shouts. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hand near his revolver while trying to understand what was happening. A well-dressed man in a black suit stood on a wooden crate, addressing the mob with theatrical gestures. "Citizens of Copper Ridge," the man bellowed, his voice carrying across the square, "these savages have committed crimes against our peaceful community. They have stolen from our stores and threatened our children. Justice must be served according to the law of the frontier." Jake pushed through the crowd, studying the faces around him. Something felt wrong about the entire situation. The 2 Apache women appeared to be sisters, both young, probably no older than 20. Their eyes showed defiance rather than guilt, and they stood with dignity despite their dire circumstances. An elderly shopkeeper next to Jake whispered nervously, "Sheriff caught them red-handed, stealing medicine and food from Peterson's store. Found them hiding in the old mine shaft up north." Jake frowned, observing the accusers more carefully. The man in the black suit introduced himself as Judge Harold Wickham, recently appointed to bring law and order to the territory. Behind him stood Sheriff Tom Bradley, a thick-set man with cold eyes and a permanent scowl. Several other men in expensive clothing nodded approvingly at the judge's words. As Jake listened to the charges being read, inconsistencies began to emerge. The stolen items were described as valuable medicines and luxury goods, but Jake had passed Peterson's store on his way into town. The small establishment looked barely stocked with basic necessities, hardly the type of place that would carry expensive merchandise. The older of the 2 Apache women suddenly spoke, her voice clear and strong despite her precarious position. "We took only bread and blanket for sick grandmother. No medicine, no valuable things. These men lie." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, drowning out her words. Judge Wickham raised his hand for silence, his face twisted in mock sympathy. "The savage speaks lies to save her wretched life. We have witnesses who saw them with stolen goods worth $50. Jake's experienced eye caught something the crowd missed. The rope around the younger woman's neck bore fresh cuts, as if it had been hastily prepared. The gallows itself looked newly constructed, the wood still bearing saw marks. Everything about this execution seemed rushed and predetermined. Moving closer to the platform, Jake noticed Sheriff Bradley kept glancing nervously toward the hills surrounding the town. Several armed men were positioned strategically around the square, but they weren't watching the crowd for trouble. Their attention was focused on the desert approaches, as if expecting someone or something to arrive. The judge continued his speech, painting a picture of Apache raids and stolen livestock that had supposedly plagued the area for months. But Jake had traveled extensively through this territory, and he knew the local Apache tribes had been peaceful for over a year. Most had moved to reservations or integrated peacefully with nearby settlements. As the execution preparations continued, Jake overheard fragments of conversation between 2 well-dressed men standing near the platform. They spoke in hushed tones about land surveys, mineral rights, and government contracts. One mentioned something about clearing troublesome elements before the railroad survey team arrived next month. The pieces began forming a disturbing picture in Jake's mind. This wasn't about stolen goods or Apache raids. Something much larger and more sinister was at work in Copper Ridge. The younger Apache woman caught Jake's eye and mouthed silent words in broken English. "Help us. We know secret." Her desperate expression told him she was trying to communicate something important, something that might explain why these two innocent women were about to die. Judge Wickham raised his hand to signal the executioner, a hooded man who stood ready to pull the lever that would open the trap doors. The crowd fell silent in anticipation of the grim spectacle. Jake made his decision in that instant. He had spent too many years drifting through the territories, witnessing injustice and doing nothing about it. Today would be different. He couldn't stand by and watch two innocent women die for a crime they clearly didn't commit. Drawing his revolver with lightning speed, Jake fired a warning shot into the air. The crowd scattered in panic as his voice boomed across the square. "Stop this execution! These women are innocent!" Sheriff Bradley immediately drew his weapon, but Jake had anticipated this reaction. Rolling behind a nearby water trough, he called out to the crowd. "Ask yourselves why these women are being hanged for stealing $50 worth of goods from a store that doesn't carry anything worth more than 2 bits. The judge's face turned red with rage. "Shoot him down! This man is obviously in league with the Apache savages." But Jake's words had planted seeds of doubt in some minds. The crowd began murmuring among themselves, questioning details of the charges that hadn't made sense before. Jake used the confusion to his advantage, moving quickly through the scattered onlookers while keeping his gun trained on the sheriff. "I've been through Peterson's store," he shouted. "It's got barely enough supplies to stock a chuck wagon, let alone $50 worth of medicine and luxury goods." Several townspeople began nodding in agreement. They knew Peterson's modest inventory better than the visiting judge apparently did. Sheriff Bradley tried to rally his men, but the crowd's mood was shifting. Doubt was spreading like wildfire through the gathering, and the certainty of moments before was crumbling. Jake reached the base of the gallows platform and pointed his revolver directly at the executioner. "Step away from that lever, or I'll put a hole through you that'll let in more light than you can handle." The hooded man hesitated, looking to the judge for guidance. Wickham's confident demeanor was beginning to crack under the pressure of unexpected resistance. "You're making a grave mistake, stranger," the judge warned. "These women are dangerous criminals who threaten the peace of our community." Jake climbed onto the platform, keeping his weapon ready while moving toward the two Apache women. "Then let's have a proper trial with real evidence instead of this rushed execution. What's the hurry, Judge? Got somewhere important to be?" The question struck home. Wickham's eyes flicked nervously toward Sheriff Bradley, confirming Jake's suspicion that time was somehow crucial to their plan. As Jake reached for his knife to cut the women's bonds, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Both women had fresh bruises on their faces and arms, marks that suggested they had been beaten recently. This wasn't just about false charges. These women had been tortured, probably to extract information about something they had witnessed. The older woman whispered urgently as Jake cut her ropes. "They kill our family. We see men hide bodies in sacred cave. Must tell truth before they silence us forever." Jake's heart pounded as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. These women weren't just innocent victims of false accusations. They were witnesses to murder, and someone was desperate enough to stage a public execution to silence them permanently. The judge's voice rose to a hysterical pitch as he realized his carefully planned execution was falling apart. "Stop him! He's helping murderers escape. Shoot them all!" But the crowd had heard the Apache woman's words, and the townspeople of Copper Ridge were beginning to understand they had almost participated in a terrible injustice. Instead of supporting the judge's orders, they began pressing forward, demanding answers about the bodies in the sacred cave. Jake helped both women down from the platform as Sheriff Bradley and his men found themselves facing an increasingly hostile crowd. The tables had turned completely, and the accusers were now being accused. "Where are these bodies?" Jake called out loudly. Let's all ride out to this sacred cave and see what evidence these women can show us. Judge Wickham made one desperate attempt to regain control. This is madness! You're all being deceived by savage lies and the ravings of a drifter. But his words fell on deaf ears. The people of Copper Ridge had lived peacefully with the local Apache for years, and many of them knew these two women by sight. They were not the dangerous criminals the judge had portrayed them to be. As the crowd began organizing to investigate the sacred cave, Jake noticed several of the well-dressed men slipping away from the square. They moved with the urgency of people who had important business elsewhere, business that couldn't wait for the truth to be revealed. The older Apache woman gripped Jake's arm tightly as they descended from the gallows. You save our lives, but danger not over. Men who kill our family very powerful. They have friends in government, friends in railroad company. They will try to stop truth. Jake nodded grimly, understanding that rescuing these women from the noose was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous confrontation. Whatever secret they had discovered was worth killing for, and the conspirators wouldn't give up easily. As the crowd began organizing a search party to investigate the sacred cave, Jake prepared himself for what was sure to be a deadly game of cat and mouse, with enemies who had money, influence, and absolutely no conscience about murdering innocent people to protect their interests. The search party rode out from Copper Ridge just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Jake Morrison led the group on his sturdy horse, with the two Apache sisters, Ayanna and Itzel, riding double on a borrowed mare. Behind them followed 20 determined townspeople, including the town doctor, the blacksmith, and several store owners who had grown suspicious of Judge Wickham's hasty justice. Sheriff Bradley had mysteriously disappeared during the confusion at the gallows, along with several of his deputies. Judge Wickham remained in town, claiming he needed to send urgent telegrams to territorial authorities about the disruption of legal proceedings. His excuse fooled no one, and Jake suspected the judge was actually warning his conspirators that their plan had failed. As they rode toward the sacred cave, Ayanna shared her story with Jake and the other riders. 3 days earlier, she and her sister had been gathering medicinal herbs near the ancient rock formations that their people considered holy ground. The cave system had been used for ceremonies and burials for generations, making it a place where Apache rarely ventured except for specific spiritual purposes. We hear voices from deep in cave, Ayanna explained in careful English. White men arguing about money and land. Sister and I, we hide behind rocks and listen. They talk about killing people who ask too many questions about mining claims. The story that emerged was far more sinister than Jake had initially imagined. The two women had witnessed a meeting between several powerful men discussing the murder of government land surveyors who had discovered irregularities in local mining claims. The surveyors had apparently found evidence that someone was filing false claims on Apache tribal lands, stealing valuable mineral rights through forged documents. Itzel, the younger sister, added details that made Jake's blood run cold. Men drag bodies into cave. 2 white men in government clothes. They say these men ask too many questions about railroad route and mining rights. Boss man say territorial governor will never investigate if Apache blamed for murders. The pieces of the conspiracy began falling into place as they rode through the desert landscape. Someone with significant political connections was systematically stealing mineral rights from Apache lands, probably with plans to sell them to railroad companies or mining corporations for enormous profits. The murdered surveyors had discovered the fraud, so they had to be eliminated. Blaming the Apache for their deaths would serve the double purpose of covering up the real motive while justifying further seizure of tribal lands. Dr. Samuel Hartley, who had ridden along to examine any bodies they might find, shook his head in disgust. I remember those 2 surveyors staying in town about a week ago. Good men, both of them. They were excited about their work, said they were documenting mineral deposits for the territorial government. When they didn't return to file their reports, everyone assumed they had moved on to the next survey area. As they approached the sacred cave, Jake noticed fresh horse tracks leading away from the area. Someone had been here recently, probably within the last few hours. The tracks suggested at least 6 riders heading north toward the Badlands, where pursuit would be difficult. The cave entrance was partially hidden by fallen rocks and desert vegetation, making it an ideal location for concealing criminal activities. Ancient Apache symbols marked the rock face around the opening, indicating the spiritual significance of the site. Jake understood why the conspirators had chosen this location. Few white settlers would venture into an Apache sacred site, and tribal members would avoid the area except for specific ceremonial purposes. Ayanna led them into the cave system, following passages that twisted deep into the rock formation. The air grew cool and damp as they moved away from the desert heat, their torches casting dancing shadows on the carved walls. Evidence of the cave's sacred nature was everywhere. From pictographs depicting Apache history to carefully arranged stone circles used for ceremonies. In a large chamber about 50 yards from the entrance, they found what they were looking for. 2 bodies lay in a shallow grave that had been hastily dug in the sandy cave floor. Dr. Hartley immediately began examining the remains, his face grim with professional concentration. "These men have been dead for about a week," the doctor announced after his initial examination. "Both show signs of being shot at close range. This wasn't a battle or a random attack. These were executions." Jake searched the bodies carefully, finding items that confirmed their identities as the missing government surveyors. More importantly, he discovered a leather document case hidden beneath one of the bodies. Inside were detailed maps, survey notes, and official correspondence that painted a damning picture of the land fraud scheme. The documents revealed that someone had been filing mining claims on Apache tribal lands using forged signatures and false documentation. The schemes involved dozens of valuable claims worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The surveyors had discovered discrepancies between the official land records and their field surveys, noting that several major claims overlapped with territory that was supposed to be permanently protected for tribal use. One particular letter caught Jake's attention. It was addressed to territorial governor from a mining company executive, discussing plans to acquire Apache lands for a new railroad route. The letter mentioned substantial payments to local officials who could facilitate the land transfers and ensure that any troublesome elements were removed from the area. "This explains everything," Jake said, showing the documents to Dr. Hartley and the other townspeople. "Someone's been stealing Apache lands through fraud, and these surveyors discovered the scheme. The murders, the false charges against Ayanna and Itzel, the rushed execution. It was all designed to cover up this conspiracy." Ayanna pointed to a corner of the cave where additional evidence had been hastily buried. They found surveying equipment, personal effects from the murdered men, and most damning of all, a notebook containing detailed records of bribes paid to local officials. The notebook listed names, amounts, and specific services purchased with blood money. Judge Wickham's name appeared repeatedly in the notebook, along with Sheriff Bradley and several other prominent citizens of Copper Ridge. The conspiracy reached high into the territorial government, involving land office officials, mining company executives, and railroad investors. The scheme was worth millions of dollars, more than enough to justify murder to protect it. As they prepared to leave the cave with their evidence, one of the townspeople noticed movement near the entrance. Jake immediately extinguished his torch and motioned for silence. Through the cave opening, he could see mounted figures positioned among the rocks outside. The conspirators had tracked them to the cave and were preparing an ambush. "How many?" whispered Dr. Hartley, checking his rifle. Jake counted carefully, noting the positions of the hidden gunmen. "At least 8, maybe more. They've got us surrounded, and they're positioned to control the only exit." The situation was desperate. The cave had only one entrance, making them sitting ducks for anyone waiting outside. But Jake realized they had advantages, too. The conspirators couldn't be sure how much evidence had been found or how many people knew about the discovery. They might be willing to negotiate rather than risk a massacre that would bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. "Listen to me," Jake called out toward the cave entrance, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We've found the bodies of the government surveyors you murdered. We've also found documents proving your land fraud scheme. You're finished, whether you kill us or not." A familiar voice answered from outside. Sheriff Bradley had returned with reinforcements. "You've got one chance, Morrison. Send out those Apache women and all the evidence you found. Do that, and we'll let the rest of you ride out alive." Jake laughed grimly. "So you can murder the witnesses and destroy the evidence?" "I don't think so, Bradley. We've got enough proof here to hang half the territory government for fraud and murder." The negotiation continued for several tense minutes, with both sides trying to gain advantage without revealing their true positions. Jake used the time to study the cave system more carefully, looking for alternative exits that Ayanna might know about. The Apache woman understood his intent and pointed toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the rock formation. "Ancient path," she whispered, "leads to second entrance on far side of mountain. Very difficult, but possible for people on foot." Jake made his decision quickly. The evidence they had discovered was too important to risk losing in a gunfight. Someone had to survive to expose the conspiracy and bring the murderers to justice. "Dr. Hartley, take 3 men and escort the sisters out through the back passage. Carry the documents and get them to the territorial capital as fast as possible. Telegraph the governor and demand an investigation." The doctor nodded, understanding the importance of preserving the evidence. "What about you and the others?" "We'll hold them here as long as possible, give you time to get away. When you're clear, we'll try to negotiate our own way out." As the escape party prepared to leave through the narrow passage, Jake organized the remaining townspeople into defensive positions. They had limited ammunition and no hope of winning a prolonged battle, but they might be able to create enough delay for the evidence to reach safety. The real fight for justice was just beginning, and Jake knew that powerful men with unlimited resources would stop at nothing to protect their criminal empire. But the truth had been uncovered, and witnesses were still alive to tell it. The conspiracy might be vast and well-connected, but it was no longer hidden in the shadows of the sacred cave. The standoff at the sacred cave stretched into the evening hours as Jake Morrison and his remaining companions held their ground against Sheriff Bradley's forces. Through careful positioning and strategic use of the cave's natural defenses, they had managed to prevent the conspirators from advancing, while Dr. Hartley's escape party disappeared into the mountain passages with crucial evidence. As darkness fell across the desert, Jake heard the sound of approaching horses from multiple directions. His heart sank, thinking Bradley had summoned additional reinforcements. Instead, he was surprised to see torches carried by a large group of Apache warriors who had surrounded the entire area. The arrival of tribal forces changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Chief Standing Bear, leader of the local Apache band, approached the cave entrance under a white flag. His weathered face showed the wisdom of years spent protecting his people from exploitation and violence. Behind him rode 30 experienced warriors, all armed and ready for battle. "Jake Morrison," the chief called out in clear English. "Dr. Hartley reached our village with news of the murdered surveyors and the evidence you discovered. My people demand justice for these crimes committed on sacred ground." Sheriff Bradley's voice carried a note of desperation as he realized his position had become untenable. "Chief, these people are interfering with lawful execution of Apache criminals. They're harboring fugitives who stole from white settlers." Chief Standing Bear's response was cold and authoritative. "We know the truth now, Bradley. Ayanna and Itzel are daughters of my brother. They committed no crimes except witnessing your murders. You and your men will surrender immediately or face the consequences of defiling sacred ground with innocent blood." The Apache warriors had positioned themselves strategically around the rock formations, cutting off all escape routes for the conspirators. Bradley and his men were now trapped between the cave defenders and a superior force that had every reason to seek violent justice. Jake emerged from the cave, understanding that the moment for peaceful resolution had arrived. "Chief, we appreciate your help, but these men need to face territorial justice for their crimes. We have evidence that reaches far beyond Copper Ridge, involving government corruption and railroad fraud." The wise chief nodded, recognizing the political implications of the conspiracy. The white man's law must handle white man's crimes, but Apache law demands satisfaction for murders committed on sacred ground. These men will answer to both. As negotiations continued, Jake learned more details about the conspiracy from Dr. Hartley, who had returned with the Apache rescue party after securing the evidence in a safe location. The documents they had discovered revealed a network of corruption that extended to the territorial capital and involved some of the most powerful men in the Southwest. The land fraud scheme had been operating for over 2 years, systematically stealing Apache mineral rights through forged documents and false surveys. Millions of dollars in mining claims had been illegally transferred to shell companies controlled by railroad investors and territorial politicians. The murdered surveyors had stumbled onto the fraud while conducting legitimate government surveys for a proposed railroad route. Judge Wickham was revealed to be not a legitimate territorial judge, but an imposter hired by the conspirators to provide legal cover for their activities. The real Judge Wickham had been murdered months earlier, with his identity stolen to facilitate the land fraud. Sheriff Bradley and several deputies were on the conspiracy's payroll, providing muscle and local law enforcement cover for the illegal activities. The scope of the conspiracy explained why the executions of Ayanna and Itzel had been so urgently arranged. The two women had witnessed not only the murders of the surveyors, but also a meeting where the conspirators had discussed expanding their operations to include Apache reservations throughout the territory. Their testimony could expose a criminal network worth millions of dollars and destroy the political careers of numerous territorial officials. As dawn approached, territorial authorities arrived in response to Dr. Hartley's telegrams. A company of cavalry soldiers, led by a federal marshal, took control of the situation from the local conspirators. The evidence from the sacred cave, combined with testimony from Ayanna and Itzel, provided federal investigators with everything they needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. Sheriff Bradley and the fake Judge Wickham were arrested, along with several other local participants in the scheme. The documents from the cave led to arrest warrants for territorial officials, mining company executives, and railroad investors across 3 territories. What had begun as a rescue mission to save 2 innocent women from hanging had exposed one of the largest land fraud conspiracies in territorial history. The trials that followed revealed the full extent of the criminal network. Testimony showed that the conspirators had stolen over $2 million worth of mineral rights from Apache lands, with plans to expand their operations to include forced relocation of entire tribal communities. The murdered surveyors had been killed because their honest work threatened to expose the fraudulent claims that formed the foundation of the scheme. Ayanna and Itzel became key witnesses in the federal trials, their courage in speaking truth despite death threats helping to convict dozens of conspirators. The sisters' testimony was particularly damning because they had witnessed not only the murders, but also planning meetings where future crimes had been discussed in detail. Jake Morrison found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of hero and key witness in the federal investigation. His quick action at the gallows had saved 2 innocent lives and prevented the destruction of crucial evidence. Federal investigators credited his intervention with breaking open a conspiracy that might otherwise have continued for years, stealing tribal lands and murdering anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure brought significant changes to the territorial government. New federal oversight was established for land office operations, with special protections for Apache tribal lands. The territorial governor, who had been implicated in the conspiracy through the recovered documents, resigned in disgrace and faced federal charges for corruption. Chief Standing Bear worked closely with federal authorities to establish new procedures for protecting tribal lands from fraudulent claims. The Apache Nation received compensation for stolen mineral rights and gained stronger legal protections against future exploitation. The sacred cave where the surveyors had been murdered was officially recognized as protected tribal territory, ensuring that such desecration could never happen again. For Jake Morrison, the events at Copper Ridge marked a turning point in his wandering life. The federal marshal offered him a position as territorial investigator, recognizing his skills in uncovering corruption and his commitment to justice. After years of drifting from town to town, Jake finally found purpose in protecting honest settlers and tribal communities from criminal exploitation. Ayanna and Itzel returned to their people as heroines, their brave testimony having protected tribal lands and brought justice for murdered innocents. The sisters used their newfound prominence to become advocates for Apache rights, working with federal authorities to prevent future exploitation of tribal communities. The conspiracy trials continued for over a year, ultimately resulting in dozens of convictions and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets. The case became a landmark in federal efforts to combat territorial corruption and protect tribal lands from fraudulent seizure. Dr. Hartley received recognition from territorial medical authorities for his crucial role in preserving evidence and coordinating the rescue of key witnesses. His detailed documentation of the murdered surveyors' remains provided forensic evidence that helped convict their killers. The people of Copper Ridge learned valuable lessons about the importance of questioning authority and demanding evidence before accepting accusations against innocent people. The town established new procedures for legal proceedings, ensuring that no future executions could be carried out without proper investigation and federal oversight. As Jake rode out of Copper Ridge for his first assignment as a territorial investigator, he reflected on how a simple stop for supplies had led to uncovering one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history. The two Apache women he had saved from the gallows had possessed knowledge that protected thousands of acres of tribal lands and exposed corruption reaching to the highest levels of government. The desert sun that had witnessed so much injustice now shone on a territory where federal law would protect honest settlers and tribal communities alike. The sacred cave that had hidden evidence of murder and fraud would remain a protected site, reminding future generations of the price of corruption and the importance of speaking truth regardless of the consequences. Jake's transformation from lone drifter to federal investigator symbolized the broader changes sweeping across the territory. Justice had prevailed through the courage of ordinary people who refused to stand by while innocents faced death for crimes they didn't commit. The harsh frontier was slowly giving way to the rule of law, protecting all citizens regardless of race or background. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and untouchable had ultimately been brought down by two young Apache women with the courage to speak truth, and one lone rider who chose justice over safety. Their combined efforts had saved not only innocent lives but also protected tribal lands and exposed corruption that threatened the integrity of territorial government. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, the town of Copper Ridge settled into peaceful prosperity under the protection of honest law and federal oversight. The gallows that had nearly claimed two innocent lives was torn down and replaced with a monument honoring the murdered surveyors and celebrating the triumph of truth over conspiracy. Justice had finally come to the frontier, carried by unlikely heroes who proved that courage and truth could overcome even the most powerful criminal networks.